No topic is bigger right now than the war between President Trump and Democrats over the so-called border wall. Things got turned up to 11 over Thursday and Friday, and let's just say both sides are up to their magic tricks once again. This time it's the old shiny things illusion at play, and most Americans fell for it hook, line, and sinker. Because while you were paying attention to what the lawmakers and majority of the media wanted you to pay attention to, namely that fight over the border wall, there was a nearly 1,200-page bill being passed that was chock full of all sorts of insanity. Yes, there were 7 different appropriation bills shoved into this vote. Yes, Congress decided to throw the bill at their members with less than 24 hours to read the damn thing. Yes, there's zero chance anyone had the actual ability to read what they were really voting on. But this is by the numbers, and that means it's time to dive into the deep end of this bill. And boy, was there some juicy stuff in this omnibus crap. Here are some of the numbers and language that caught my eye. $1.375 billion. That was what Trump actually got in border wall funding, but that funding came with an amazing amount of caveats, which included things like Section 232A, stating that any spending of said border wall funding can only be spent in the Rio Grande Valley sector and can only be put up with agreement from local elected officials. Guess which party controls those local governments? Yes, 90% of the heads of counties in the RGV sector are Democrat. You think for 1 second they'll allow Trump to put the wall or fence or anything up in this hyper-partisan time? Also tucked into this bill, in regards to immigration, is this nugget, Section 224A, which gives deportation immunity to any sponsor or potential sponsor of an unaccompanied alien child, whether they do or don't live or will potentially or won't potentially live with the child. If you don't believe me, here's a look at the actual language of the bill. None of the funds provided by this act or any other act, or provided from any accounts in the Treasury of the United States derived by the collection of fees available to the components funded by this act, may be used by the Secretary of Homeland Security to place in detention, remove, refer for a decision whether to initiate removal proceedings or initiate removal proceedings against a sponsor, potential sponsor, or member of a household of a sponsor or potential sponsor of an unaccompanied alien child. Some will say these provisions are meant to keep families together, and thus not detaining adults will not separate them from their children. No one with any form of empathy wants to see legitimate families ripped apart. But fraud of the system already in place happens all the time. Drug traffickers, human sex traffickers, and coyotes use bogus family statuses to get in and stay in the United States already. They do it thanks to the power of fear and intimidation of unaccompanied minors, whom they use as props for bogus claims of parental and familial relationships. But we can't have that adult conversation, because it means acknowledging that there are bad people out there willing to do horrific things to children, all in the name of finding their way into this country by hook or crook. Having that conversation would mean confronting what makes you feel good with what is really happening. I'm not afraid of that conversation, though, and that has a lot to do with the simple fact that part of my 9 to 5 is literally combating fraud for an entire company. It has my eyes wide open to the lengths people will go to get away with not having to do the right thing. The reality is, separating children from parents, even for a brief time at separate facilities, is vital in the process of weeding out fraud from real familial connections. Making the children feel safe to tell the truth without fear of retribution is an important step, and that means not housing them at the same facilities, even if that would be on the same base or compound. Making sure the adults don't have access to children right away is a sad reality of what the bad actors have created on the border. I say losing one child to human smuggling and sex trafficking is one too many. I'm willing to pay the temporary price of an hour or two or a day with parents separated from children, then allow these sick people to get away with a lifetime of pain, misery, and death for children caught up in their sick game. So reading the language in this bill piqued my spidey senses in a way some others may not have had that happen, in this section at least. The language we brought up earlier while talking about this bill is so ambiguous that it's easy to see fraud happening on a large scale. Don't think for 1 second that sophisticated smuggling rings won't exploit this language and thus gain permanent status to stay in the United States. Don't think for 1 second that human traffickers or sex slavery rings won't exploit this to be able to set up permanent pipelines into this country. Politicians may want to pander to the "we have to keep families together every step of the way" crowd, But as we've already discussed, the reality on the ground is deadly different. Instead of making the job of combating fraud easier for Border Patrol and ICE, Congress decided to make it harder to keep bad actors out of the United States. In fact, our government has made a wholly untouchable class of people, totally immune from prosecution for the very crime that got him or her here in the first place. Hell, the way this law reads, there's nothing that will get them deported, not even committing serious crimes while here in the country, thanks to the ambiguous language in this bill. The only question is, if said language superseded other deportation language in other bills, will ICE still be able to go after criminals who are also illegally here, even if they are claiming potential status with an unaccompanied minor? I'm guessing that is one for the courts to decide, and it's a mess that Congress shouldn't have been able to create to begin with. Which brings me to this point. I'm sick and tired of the "you only care about children in the womb, where is your compassion for them once they're born" refrain from the Democrats. By putting the language they did into this bill, they've lost any right to lecture anyone about caring for the well-being of children. Same goes for all the Republicans who knew of this section and decided it was a good idea. And same to you, Mr. President, for signing the law even after conservatives screamed bloody murder about this crap bill. Congrats, politicians in Washington, D.C. Only you could have managed to make it easier and inimitable for the worst actors to exploit the very children you tell us you care about more than me. Screw you. Straight up, screw you for what you're about to do to the most vulnerable of people on the border. It's simply disgusting. But we also have other things to discuss with this bill. So let's get back to some of the other numbers in this monstrosity. Take, for instance, $333 billion. That's the total amount appropriated to the 9 cabinet agencies left to be funded for fiscal 2019. $40 million, which was given to the Alternatives to Deportation program, a program meant to move asylum seekers away from the border and into the interior of the country. And guess what happens when that occurs? You got it. They end up released from U.S. custody altogether and magically never actually proceed through the asylum process. In fact, just 2% of those claiming asylum at the border ever show up for their hearings. 2. Federal workers are now receiving a second pay raise in fiscal 2019. This bill gives a 1.9% pay increase to federal workers who already received a cost of living adjustment and step pay scale increases this fiscal year. Never mind the fact that federal workers are already receiving and making more than their exact counterparts in the private sector. $3.3 billion. That's the cost of the federal pay increase, which will balloon to a total of $40 billion in the next 10 years, thanks to the language in this bill. This week's final number, 11. Just 11 United States senators decided to say no to this monstrosity in the end. To them, thank you for standing up on principle, and those 11 names are Tom Cotton, Marco Rubio, Mark Braun, Rand Paul, Joshua Hawley, Ben Sasse, Jim Inhofe, Pat Toomey, Tim Scott, Ted Cruz, and Mike Lee. There were 5 Democratic senators that said no to this bill as well, but those votes were because they opposed any funding for more security, and it provided a false choice, whatever that meant. In the end, this bill, if enacted as written, has sweeping immigration consequences and only furthers the dysfunctional nature of the budgeting process. It took 4.5 months to get this piece of junk to pass. Think about that. Sadly, most of them don't care, and we'll be right back in the same situation in September because no one wants to do the hard thing in the face of a 2-year presidential cycle in full swing. Don't forget, you can continue to help us fight false narratives, lies, and hypocrisy by hitting the subscribe button below and also the notifications bell since subscriptions apparently aren't enough anymore here on YouTube. Until next week, I'm Andrew Coppins, and let's continue this conversation over on Twitter at The Coppins Show.